Max, on your point about Hamas's fighting capabilities, I'm wondering if you saw this quote from Giora Island, who's a
Yeah.
retired major general, former head of Israel's National Security Council. He said, from a professional point of view, I must give credit to their resilience. I cannot see any signs of collapse of the military abilities of Hamas, nor in their political strength to continue to lead Gaza.
Yeah, that's Giora Eland, who is a former major general, very high-ranking figure in the Israeli military, who's now at the Israeli state-sponsored think tank, the Institute for National Security Studies. And he's the guy who, by the way, recommended that Israel create not only famine, but spawn disease across Gaza to force the population to leave. But, you get candor from these characters. And he is acknowledging that Hamas cannot be militarily defeated. It can't be confronted head on. But if you understand who Giora Eland is, this is someone who's always recommended disproportionate force against civilians, then you understand he's not calling for an end to the war or a ceasefire. He's calling for an intensification of the war against civilians. But at the same time, you have this acknowledgement that wasn't present before among key veterans, like the highest ranking figures in the Israeli military elite, that the objective of eradicating Hamas or defeating Hamas, as the U.S. and the Biden administration understand it, is delusional. Here's Dan Halutz, the former Israeli Army Chief of Staff, former head of the Israeli Air Force. He says that Israel has lost the war against Hamas in Gaza. He means they've lost the military war. And he said that the real victory will be the removal of Netanyahu, who there's a consensus within the Israeli military intelligence apparatus, the military elite, that Netanyahu is at fault for October 7th and for this failure, and they want him out.
Here's one more. This is Michael Milstein, former senior Israeli intelligence officer, criticizing statements from Israeli leaders that Hamas is at a breaking point. He said, quote, "They've been saying this for a while, that Hamas is collapsing, but it's just not true. Every day we're facing tough battles."
Yeah. And the question is, how much longer can Israel go attempting to implement this three-tiered plan while it's taking so many casualties in the Gaza Strip? This is a very casualty-adverse society. I always make the point that Israel pioneered UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, drone technology, because it could not withstand casualties. This started during the Lebanon invasion, when it entered the Lebanese civil war. It disrupts Israeli politics and Israeli society too much to take hundreds of casualties. They're now well over the 160 mark, and they're hiding casualties for sure. Many of the casualties they're hiding are people on the verge of death in Israeli hospitals, which have the highest level of technology and are keeping likely hundreds of men barely alive. You have wounded. You have now a suicide plague among the Israeli military, among the reservists. You see reports of Israeli reservists who have lost their businesses, their small businesses, and have been reduced to poverty because they've been in the field for so long and can't go back to work. So this puts increasing pressure on a society that values a middle-class Western lifestyle. And then you have Avigdor Lieberman today, former long-serving right-wing Israeli military minister, sort of the head of the Russian-Israeli, longtime political leader of the Russian-Israeli public, complaining that 200,000 Israelis are displaced from their homes and have no way to go back. The Israeli government just announced that the residents of Sderot will be paid basically to live in hotels outside their city, and will have to exist on welfare because they can't go home anytime soon. In the north, it's 100,000 people who can't go home. And the strikes by Hezbollah are increasing. So Israel's borders have been kind of shifted. And this is just the political crisis is just beginning. Meanwhile, and I think this needs to be acknowledged by the U.S. media, the U.S. mainstream media. That New York Times article, I don't know what you thought of it, Aaron, but I thought it is pretty weak compared to what we're seeing from the Al-Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas. But they're not acknowledging, they're not really describing what it looks like in the field for the Israeli military. And I wanted to show a recent video of Al-Qassam achievements. I think if I play it with no volume, it won't have any impact on our already suppressed reach. Whoops, volume came on. But this is something that I think, and Aaron, I'd like to get your thoughts on whether this is just anecdotal evidence of Israeli losses, or this is something more systemic. Here is a Al-Qassam fighter in Shujaiya striking an Israeli Merkava tank with a Yasin 105 rocket-propelled grenade, which is has a tandem charge to specifically penetrate tanks. That's another hit. And these videos are just coming out day after day, showing Israeli soldiers taking casualties, showing tanks being hit, and yes, they're actually being destroyed. This is these words you see are were written on a wall by these Qassam fighters in a destroyed house in Shujaiya, and it says, "From here, we destroyed 3 armored vehicles and killed a soldier." And they're doing that to show the Israeli forces that they were there and that they left and that they survived the attack. These are not martyrdom operations. These are, okay, now here you see they're targeting Israeli forces who are bunkered in a home that they're occupying, which once belonged to a Palestinian family. And those red arrows signify casualties, who are about to be casualties. And they hit them with, this may be a weapon that hadn't been rolled out yet, which is a thermobaric weapon designed to hit pillboxes and bunkers. Did a massive amount of destruction there. Israel announced something like 6 casualties the day after these attacks, which you see. Now here are 10 soldiers. There, you can see one soldier is actually filming on his phone. He's like filming for TikTok or something. Let's go back. And they have no idea that they're being watched. There he is. He's just filming. They're saying, we hit 10 soldiers in this strike. Certainly there are casualties, heavy casualties there. Here's another strike on a Merkava tank. They're calling it in. You can see they operate through non-encrypted lines. This shows you the kind of cellular structure of the Al-Qassam brigades. They operate in small teams independently of one another. They often bring someone who is a spotter who uses just a common DSLR camera. And here's another Israeli soldier caught bunkering. They basically have nothing to do and nowhere to go there. And they're just kind of the Israelis are just forced to simply hold territory, which makes them sitting ducks. They don't know where to look for Hamas targets. They only know how to carry out field execution. So they're preparing the Yasin 105 RPG, which has armor-piercing rounds. They're small arms fire, and they have clearly struck their target and done enormous amounts of structural damage and likely caused casualties. Now here's a grenade attack on Israeli soldiers who are just milling around in the streets of Shujaiya, where they said they had an operational hold. And there's the rescue team, which receives small arms fire. And you can see the stretcher where they were evacuating a soldier, which they were using to evacuate a soldier, was left on the ground in haste as they ran away. And the reason you're able to see this is the Qassam team that carried out this attack brought their footage back. They survived. They went back to base. Again, these are not martyrdom operations, and they often take the equipment that you see there from Israeli soldiers and use it in the field. Again, they're also using unexploded munitions that are dropped on the Gaza Strip, creating, for example, the Shawaz bomb, which is kind of like a TV bomb that's placed by hand at the weakest point of Merkava tanks. You can easily find video of Qassam fighters doing that, just delivering by hand a giant bomb to the back of a Merkava tank, which is the weakest, most vulnerable point, because that's where the Israeli soldiers will enter and leave the tank. So the door is there. This is a military crisis for Israel. And I don't know. What are your thoughts, Aaron, on where this is going?
Well, it just makes sense to me that the occupying power, as happens to all occupiers, gets sort of drunk on its own power, filled with contempt and dehumanization for the people it's occupying. And so it can't fathom that they could possibly effectively resist with armed force. But as even Israeli officials that we've quoted are admitting, Hamas is inflicting damage. And this just seems to be a pattern. I'm just reading about Vietnam. There was a similar attitude that, like, how could these villagers in huts, go up against the most powerful military in the world? And Vietnam, even though it was destroyed, it did hold out. And this footage to me underscores that we're seeing a similar dynamic here. I mean, the problem is I just can't help but think about, again, who does Israel punish for its losses? It punishes the civilians of Gaza. Who did it punish after October 7th? The civilians of Gaza, which it always does. And but it's true, looking at that, if that footage there is representative of what Israel is facing, the question, as you raised, is how long can they continue this for? Because obviously there's no pressure on them coming from Biden. That's not a factor here. It just isn't. They have carte blanche. But sustaining casualties does impose a cost, and Israel can't sustain that, it seems. So that's just fascinating footage to watch. It's incredible to get that look at what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, there's new footage out today, also on Al-Qassam channels. You can follow a mirrored Telegram account and see all of it, or there are, resistance-related accounts on Twitter where you can just see it all. But I think the U.S. media needs to show this to the American public to show what they are paying for and the failures in the field. Of course, they didn't do this with the Ukrainian military at all. They didn't show us the counteroffensive that we knew would fail. So who can expect them to do this? They didn't show us the U.S. military failing in Afghanistan miserably during the surge and after, with a completely fake Afghan army. So who can expect that? Honestly, the U.S. media showed more of what was taking place in Vietnam through Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather than they are now. And it's why they're so discredited, because everyone is watching these on social media. Everyone. I mean, I talked to an old timer in DC, a foreign policy old timer who's in his 70s, who was telling me how he's watching all these Qassam videos and he's just blown away. Now, I learned about these in 2014, only when I went to Gaza, because, they were broadcasting them on TV. Everyone was talking about them. The spokesman for the Al-Qassam brigades, Abu Obaida, would appear and show highlights and announce how many vehicles had been attacked. This was, Israel had pulled out by the time I got in, and they were just doing aerial attacks. But at that point, Twitter was not as video friendly. It was very difficult to publish video on Twitter. Social media just wasn't quite ready to accommodate this kind of GoPro footage. And now we've reached a point where, at least on Twitter X, it's free enough. I mean, the censorship is still coming back, but it's free enough and the video compatibility is so strong that I think the international public can really get a sense of what's happening on the ground in a way they hadn't before. And I follow Hebrew Israeli language accounts, which publish GoPros from Israeli soldiers' helmets. And often they'll show themselves rescuing a buddy in the field to show their valor and their bravery. They're not showing them. This is the thing. You'll never, or I don't know when you're going to see them confronting Qassam militants face to face in the same way. You'll see them blowing up buildings on the official IDF accounts, but the soldiers will publish this footage of them rescuing their wounded buddies. And the footage is horrible. I mean, it looks like Vietnam footage from one of the Vietnam films that might have come out in the 1980s. Just bloody guys laying around screaming for help, and then they have to be immediately medevaced, and the helicopter comes in and they're taken off to a hospital in Tel Aviv. So how long can this go on is the question. How quickly can they get genocide done? What preponderance of intervening forces can prevail on Israel to slow down their genocidal march? We're going to know that in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And that's for sure.
And meanwhile, Max, can I ask you what's happening on the other front? So the West Bank, I know this week Israel increased its attacks there. I know some soldiers have recently even been wounded there. And there's also the border with Lebanon, where there's still, Israel's been making new threats to Lebanon that unless you deal with Hezbollah, we're going to deal with Hezbollah, which I don't know how Israel would do that because Hezbollah actually can fight back. But what do you make of those two areas, the West Bank and the border with Lebanon?
Well, you have two major battlefronts in the West Bank. Well, the major battlefronts in the north, that's the area that the PA fails to control. Tulkarm, the city of Tulkarm, is a major battlefront where forces that cohered around a non-partisan, sort of non-aligned organization called the Lion's Den in 2021, 2022, which started confronting the Israeli military directly there. Nablus and Jenin are continuing to fight every day, and the Israeli military is sending in more and more forces. They sent in the largest number of soldiers yet into Jenin. I think 3,000 went in the other day for raids, this week for raids. And those Palestinian resistance fighters are using not only small arms, which are not as easily available in the West Bank, but they're also employing the Shawaz bomb that I mentioned before, which are hand-placed IEDs. I think they're much more sophisticated in the Gaza Strip, using armor-piercing nails and so on. But they're placing them in front of bulldozers and tanks, and they have been causing casualties among Israeli soldiers there. And so Israel this week, through its war cabinet, designated 5 money exchange centers in West Bank cities, including Ramallah, as terrorist organizations. And they believe that the money there is being used by those resistance fighters to purchase weapons on the black market. They just can't crush them. They can't get them down. And so they raided them, ambushed them through with special forces Yamam teams, killed employees, killed people who fought back, and stole $3 million in cash from these Palestinian money exchange shops in Ramallah. And I believe there were some raids in Nablus. So Israel is conducting piracy across the West Bank. Meanwhile, in the rural areas, as our contributor Jeremy Lafredo documented, the Israeli settlers continue to carry out their own genocidal assault on the weakest links within the Palestinian population there, the rural villages that rely on farming, shepherding, and they have ethnically cleansed dozens of villages. Jeremy showed how people were forced to live in caves because their village had been so terrorized that they could no longer live there. Others are just on the verge of breaking. This is all happening under the watch of a democratic government in Washington, which claims, with capital D Democrat, which claims to support the two-state solution. And we're also seeing images out of the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, in the old city, of Armenians coming under violent assault by fanatical Israeli settlers and being driven out of their own quarter. They want to establish a new Jewish quarter in the Armenian quarter. These fanatical cultists who believe in the third temple are doing this. And where is Washington? And JFK, John F. Kennedy, proposed that the old city and Jerusalem itself be an international city. And here you have the Biden administration just letting all of this take place day after day, not even in the Gaza Strip, but in the Armenian quarter. There's no Hamas there.
Biden early on in his presidency, he said something about how basically until Israel's neighbors recognize its right to exist, there will not be peace. Basically was threatening continued state terror against the Palestinians and everybody else until they all recognize Israel's so-called right to exist. Why should anybody have to affirm the right to exist of this insane state that is hell-bent on killing everybody that's not in its own ethnic group? It's just such an insane demand. And that's a demand that guarantees there will never be any peace because, people have the right to exist. States don't have the right to exist, especially if their existence is premised on destroying everyone else's existence. And so Biden is complicit in all this, and they've decided they're going to just, it doesn't matter to them. Even though Biden's approval ratings now are the lowest of any modern presidency heading into a tough election. That Gallup just put that out. They don't care. That's how committed he is to Israeli dominance.
Yeah. I mean, what they don't have, it shows they don't have a right to exist. I mean, first of all, states, countries, they don't have rights like individuals do. That's just phony. So Israel's right to self-defense, these are just phony talking points. But when they say Israel's right to exist, they don't mean a right to exist. They mean a right to exist as a Jewish exclusivist apartheid state.
Yeah.
The Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1988, in 1990, ahead of the Madrid talks, the beginning of the failed and calamitous peace process, recognized Israel's right to exist, but they would not recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Why? Because, just within Israel's 1948 borders, to the extent they even exist, there are some 1.5 to 2 million Palestinian citizens whose rights would be formally subjugated if the Palestinian Authority, representing its Palestinians before the world, were to recognize Israel as a so-called Jewish state. And then you have like these Zionist supremacists on mainstream networks like Jake Tapper, who constantly bring this up. They won't even recognize, Hamas doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. Jake Tapper would not recognize the United States' right to exist as a white Christian nation because he's Jewish. Neither would I. It would mean that we'd be second-class citizens formally. So that's sort of what this comes down to. All of the rights that Israel's demanding are not going to be obtained through negotiation. They're fighting right now for their right to exist as an exclusivist Jewish state through genocide because they realize that's the only way they can achieve it.